In Vietnam, they tell a Cinderella story. It begins the way you expect. It does not end the way you expect. The stepmother does not survive it. Neither does the sister. And the girl in the slipper, they killed her 4 times before she got her ending. Her name was Tam. She was the orphan daughter of a farmer in a village north of the river, and after her father died, she lived in his house with the woman he had married second, and with the woman's daughter, Cam. Cam was the younger by a year, and her name in their language means the broken rice, the husks the children sift from the good grain on a winnowing tray. It would matter later. Tam was given the work. Cam was given the silk. And every morning at the well in the yard, while Tam pounded the rice for breakfast and carried the water for the household, the same smudge of gray ash from the cooking fire settled above her left eye and would not wash off, no matter how she scrubbed at it. By the time she was 16, the mark was a small dark place on her brow that her stepmother and her sister had stopped seeing. She had not. She had stopped trying to make it leave. The King's Festival came in the spring of Tam's 17th year. Heralds rode through the village calling the news from house to house. Every young woman of the district was to come to the river road in her best clothes, for the king had ridden out from the capital and would pass that way at dusk to look at his country and the people in it. Cam was given new silk and a jade comb. Tam was set a different task. The stepmother poured a basket of whole rice and a basket of broken rice together onto the floor of the kitchen and told Tam, in a small, steady voice, that she could go to the festival the moment the two were separated again into their 2 baskets. Then the stepmother and Cam walked out of the house in their new clothes and closed the door behind them. Tam sat down on the kitchen floor and wept. She did not weep loudly. She had stopped weeping loudly years ago. As the room darkened, she became aware that she was not alone. Small birds had come in through the open shutter and were sorting the rice. Whole grains in one basket, broken grains in the other. They worked without hurry and without sound, and Tam, who knew enough not to ask, did not ask. When the floor was clean, she remembered something her mother had told her on the last morning of her life. She went to the corner of the yard where she had buried 3 years ago the bones of a small kind fish that the stepmother had cooked for spite. She dug them up. They were not bones anymore. From the dark earth, she lifted a folded silk tunic the color of the inside of a peach, 2 combs of carved jade, and a pair of small embroidered slippers. She dressed in the yard, and she walked down the river road in the last light. She saw the king's procession from across the water. She did not stop. As she crossed the wooden bridge in the dusk, her right slipper came loose, and before she could turn back, it had slid between the planks and dropped into the current. The river carried it down the length of the country and put it onto a sandbar below the king's barge. He took it from his boatman, held it on his palm, and gave the order that his men were to find the foot it fitted. They found her in the kitchen of her stepmother's house, in plain clothes again, with the silk and the jade and the one remaining slipper folded under the rice pounder where her sister would not look. The dark mark above her left eye was visible in the lamplight. The king saw it. He was not bothered. Tam went to the capital. She was made the king's wife. There was a quiet wedding without her stepmother and without her sister, who had not been invited. For a few seasons, there was such happiness in her life as she had never imagined a house could contain. Then, in the 3rd year of her marriage, came the death anniversary of her father. Filial duty is older than any other story in this country, and Tam went home to the village to honor it. Her stepmother received her at the door with a small, composed mouth and asked her to do one thing for the household before the offering. The tallest betel-nut palm in the yard had a high cluster of fruit, and the offering required the fresh nuts. Would the queen, who had climbed that tree 100 times as a girl, climb it once more for her father? Tam climbed. She was halfway up the smooth gray trunk when the saw began. It was a small saw, and her stepmother used it slowly. The trunk shivered, and Tam called out. And the trunk shivered again, and the palm went over toward the well at the corner of the yard. The water closed over the place where she fell. The stepmother carried the saw and the silk back into the house and shut the door. The next morning, she told the neighbors, in a small, steady voice, that her poor stepdaughter had gone home to her husband at the palace. The neighbors believed her, because the neighbors had seen the queen's chariot at the gate the night before, and a small, steady voice is what people believe. The court did not question it either, because Cam walked into the palace gate 3 days later in Tam's festival silk with the dark mark drawn carefully above her left eye in soot. And the king's officials, who had only ever seen the queen at a distance, bowed to her and let her pass. The king saw at once that the woman who walked into his apartments was not his wife. He did not say so. He had been raised at court, and he had learned long ago that a thing seen is not the same as a thing acted on. Cam took the queen's rooms and ate at the queen's table and slept on the queen's mat, and the king grew thin and quiet and would not look at her. In the western garden of the palace, a small bird began to sing in the mornings. It was a golden oriole, very small, very bright, and the first time the king passed beneath its tree, it flew down and perched on his sleeve and would not leave him. He carried it on his wrist for the rest of the day. The court began to whisper. There was a single dark feather above the bird's left eye in the place where, on a face, a small mark of ash might sit. The king saw it. He did not say so. He had the bird brought to his private rooms at night and let it sleep on the low rail above his bed, and in the morning he would lift his hand and the bird would come back to it. Cam saw this from her own apartments and understood, in the only flash of clear sight she ever had, that the king would never look at her the way he looked at the small bright bird on his wrist. She caught the oriole herself early one morning before the king had risen. She killed it in her hand. She ate the meat alone in her rooms. She threw the feathers out the western window into the garden below. From the place in the garden where the feathers had fallen, a single peach tree grew in one night. By morning, it stood 10 feet tall against the western wall, in full pink blossom out of season, and every gardener and groundskeeper in the palace came to see it. The king came too. He looked at the tree for a long time and then had a stone bench placed beneath it. He sat under the peach tree every afternoon for the rest of the spring. He ate his small meals there. He read his petitions there. He fell asleep there in the warm middle of the day with the blossom moving above him. There was a dark knot in the bark, above eye level on the western side, in the place where on a small bird a single dark feather had been. The king did not point at it. He simply sat beneath it. Cam asked the gardener to cut the tree down. The gardener refused. Cam took the carpenter's axe from the workshop and went into the western garden at dusk when the king had gone in to supper, and she cut the peach tree down herself and had the wood carried away. The palace carpenter was a quiet man who had served 3 kings. He took the wood of the felled peach tree and, without asking anyone what it had been, built from it a small floor loom of the kind the queen's women used for the fine silk. The loom was carried, on the carpenter's own instruction, to the queen's apartments and set up there as a gift. When Cam touched the shuttle, the loom began to weave by itself. The shuttle ran without a hand. The treadle pressed without a foot. Threads moved into the warp that had not been set on the beam. Cam's name appeared in the cloth, in clean black characters across white silk. The word thief appeared beside it. And then the loom spoke aloud in front of all the queen's women in a voice that was Cam's own, but slower and older and very tired.
You took the silk, you took the king, and you took the slipper. The girl who fell out of the tree is coming for hers.
There was a dark knot in the beam above the shuttle, in the place where on a peach tree a single dark knot had been. The queen's women saw it and were silent. Cam had the loom carried out of her apartments into the western garden, and she set it on fire herself. It burned slowly. The ash drifted on the evening wind over the western wall toward the road that ran to the city gate. There was an old woman who sold tea to travelers at a small stand by the western gate. She had no children and no husband anymore, and she swept the dust outside her door at first light every morning with the same kind of patience that a person uses who has lived for a long time without anyone watching. On the morning after the loom burned, an old woman picked up something on the path in front of her stall. It was a single fragrant fruit, a vusua, the star apple, with smooth, pale green skin. There was a dark mark on the skin in the place where, on a face, a small mark of ash might sit. She took the fruit home and set it on the small altar in her one room. She did not eat it. The next morning, she came back from market to find her floor swept, her tea water boiled, her sleeping mat aired in the sun. The fruit was still on the altar. She told no one. This went on for some weeks. Then one evening, she came home earlier than usual and found a grown young woman standing in her doorway, in plain village clothes, with long dark hair in a single braid and a small dark mark above her left eye. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Tam knelt and pressed her forehead to the old woman's hands, which were knotted with work, and the old woman put her old hands on Tam's shoulders and made no sound. They lived in the small house together for one more month, while the queen at the palace slept in the queen's bed and the king sat under nothing in the western garden because there was no longer a tree there. One evening, the king's hunting party passed the western gate at dusk on the way back to the palace. The king stopped his horse outside the tea stand. He looked at the doorway of the small house. He did not move for a long time. Then he got down from his horse and he walked to the door and he said very quietly, the private name he had only ever used to one person. Tam came back to the palace. The court was summoned. The marriage was made again, this time in the great red hall with all the officials of the kingdom present, and the dark mark above the queen's left eye was visible to everyone who looked. Cam was not told that her sister was alive until the morning of the second wedding. She came forward in the queen's pink silk that she had been wearing for 3 years, and she looked at Tam, and she did not understand what she was seeing. After the ceremony, in the private moment that the court gives a queen and her family, Cam asked her older sister carefully how she had become so beautiful. Tam told her. She told her plainly, the way you tell a child a recipe, what to do and in what order. Cam listened. Cam thanked her. Cam went back to her mother's house in the village that afternoon and did exactly what her older sister had described, exactly in the order she had described it. A few days later, a small clay jar arrived at the stepmother's door, sent from the palace with a polite note in the queen's own hand. The note said the jar was a gift. The note said the jar contained fish sauce of a special preparation made according to a family recipe the queen had recently remembered. The stepmother read the note. The stepmother opened the jar. The stepmother ate. In the great red hall of the palace, on the evening of the same day, the lantern light was very steady. The king sat at the queen's right hand. The dark mark above the queen's left eye was visible in the long shot down the hall. There was no music. There was no speaking. The story ends in silence. This was Forgotten Fables. Follow the channel when you want the next story the loud world forgot.